Okay, I want to preface this entire video by first making one thing clear. I really like this game. As of this recording, I've now got north of 200 hours playtime between preview events earlier this year, the beta weekend back in May, and over the past couple of weeks, I've been participating in the private closed beta, which I can now finally talk about. Overall, I've had a lot of fun. In fact, even after all of this time, I am still excited for launch and expect I'll probably double my playtime at least. So yes, I like Dune Awakening, but it does have issues. In fact, consider this video my attempt at honing in on some of the bigger, more glaring concerns I have, with the hope that these are areas in which they can improve things, making a game that I already enjoy even better. Okay, let's just jump right into it. First up are some server concerns, and there is a couple of layers to this one. So for starters, I expect launch day, if not the entire first weekend, to be a bit of a mess. If you are watching this video on release, I think there's a decent chance that we are dealing with long queue times or servers that are straight up down, and if you do get in and actually get to play, there's an equally strong chance of dealing with a lot of lag, rubber banding, rollbacks, the whole shebang. Now, they have already released the launch day server list, and for NA alone, I counted 40 servers in total, which are further divided into 20 Sietches. You can think of those as just sub-servers that feed into the main server, and the Sietches are where all of your progression and character live in the first half of the game when you're playing in the Haga Basin map. Now, we know that Sietches can hold between 40 to 60 players simultaneously, and they upped that cap from what was previously 40 up to 60 fairly recently. So the napkin math here means that they have got enough servers and Sietches in North America to support between 32,000 and 48,000 concurrent players, with there being additional servers for EU, as well as some for Asia, Oceania, and South America. And that sounds like it might not be enough, to be honest. I mean, who knows how many people are going to play this game, but 48,000 concurrent just for North America might be on the low end. Now, I assume they could, of course, spin up more servers and subsequent Sietches if the demand is there, but if North America alone can only hold a max of 48,000 players logged in concurrently, I do expect there to be issues. Basically, the entire litany of problems that tend to affect many big multiplayer games on release when you've got thousands of people trying to log in simultaneously, clogging the servers, resulting in poor play experience if you can even get in to play at all. This will probably happen. It's not Dune specific, but I would say there's a decent chance that that fun experience that we are all unfortunately so used to could happen here as well. And if it doesn't, and if launch day server stability is great and we can all get in and play, I will be pleasantly surprised. I'm not expecting that, but I hope it does happen. That'd be great. I would love to be surprised and for that launch experience to be fine. But my server concerns actually extend beyond any launch specific issues. It is also just with how the whole server and Sietch system is structured in general. So how this works is the first thing you do is you pick a server, and then within that server, as mentioned, you've got 20 available Sietches that you then select. Each of those Sietches are essentially just their own server specifically for Haga Basin, and all of those then feed into the Deep Desert, which is the larger PvP focused map that you get to in the end game, which is what happens after Haga Basin. And the problem that we may very well run into, and I suspect a lot of people will, is if you pick a Sietch that has more than 60 other people currently logged in, you're going to have to wait in a queue until somebody leaves and opens up a spot. And if there's a lot of people doing that, you're going to have to wait that much longer. Now, dealing with full servers and queues in order to get in, that's not uncommon in these kinds of games. But when the full server size of a map is 60 people total, that could be a problem fairly often. It's going to especially be a problem if you are unlucky enough to pick a Sietch that is already crowded, or maybe even worse, what if you pick a Sietch that gets crowded after you picked it? So you might be progressing your character, playing for a few days, building up your different bases and going through and doing the whole thing, and then maybe you log in on Sunday and the server's full and you can't get in for 2 hours. That might very well happen, and all of your progression, you can bring your character across Sietches, but all of your base progression, all of your storage, everything that you've built up over the first few days, if the Sietch then becomes crowded later on and you just can't log in because you're in queue for nobody's leaving, that could be potentially very, very annoying. Another problem is going to be if you happen to be a person that's playing with a large group of friends or even a big guild. Now, currently the guild size is capped at about 32 people, which is about half of the total cap per siege. That doesn't leave a lot of extra room for any non-guild players before all of a sudden the siege that you're in and all of you have progressed your bases on and all of your storage and your inventory. If there are more than 60 people trying to get into your siege, your sub-server of the main server, you might just be locked out for half a day. I mean, we don't really know. We're gonna have to see how the few subsequent days post-launch end up going. And then there's the whole deep desert. Now, in a recent interview with Shroud, we learned what to expect in terms of player counts for this map at release, and those numbers do have me a bit worried. Currently, at launch, the Deep Desert looks to be capped at 300 concurrent players, quite a bit lower than the roughly 1,000 that we had heard previously. And as just covered, we know that each server has a single Deep Desert that the 20 sub-server Sietches all feed into. And those 20 Sietches, each with a cap of 60 concurrent players, is 1,200 concurrent players max. If you have a full server with max player count, there's 1,200 people spread across the Sietches, all feeding into one server Deep Desert, and that Deep Desert can only hold 300 concurrent max players. That means 1/4 of the max concurrent player base on any given server can get into the end game at any given time, and the remaining 3/4, they just got to stay in Haga Basin on their Sietches until one of the 300 cap players decides to leave the Deep Desert. So if more than 300 people want to play, yeah, you're going to be sitting in queues to get into the end game, to get into the Deep Desert. And that's the issue, I think, between the Sietches being capped at 60 max players and the Deep Desert being capped at 300 max concurrent players. Forget about any potential launch issues with like servers being clogged and queue times and down servers. Anyone that's on a busy server or siege could be looking at queue times in general to get into their siege and or to get into the Deep Desert, and that could be a problem for some people for many days, potentially even weeks. That is one of my first primary biggest concerns. Next up, there is the combat. And I mean, it's not really a concern per se. I just wish it were a little better feeling. It's good enough that I've still played for over 200 hours and have enjoyed myself. So yeah, there's that. But I just want to reiterate, I think Melee in particular, even with some of the improvements that have been made, it's still not very impactful feeling. Now, I know concessions are often made with games like this, these big shared open world games, especially ones that have free building, where players can build bases everywhere that all of the other players see, and the fact that you do have other players running around, up to 60 in the Haga Basin, up to 300 in the Deep Desert, and that each of these maps are absolutely gargantuan with no loading screens while you're in these areas going through all of these different zones. That's really cool, but all of that stuff does come at a cost pulled from elsewhere, and it definitely feels like the impactful feeling of combat is one of those areas where that has been pulled. And when this topic is brought up, people often ask, like, what does it mean for combat not to feel good? Now, I'd say that this is basically a culmination of any given game's animations, the sound effects, some UI elements, and input latency, and any other forms of feedback players get whenever you swing a sword, shoot a gun, or cast an ability. Now, I will say again, I think the range combat feels decent. It's not the most visceral third-person shooting that I've ever experienced in the sound and visual feedback department, but it's still good enough that it feels decent when you're shooting targets. I will add that movement, on the other hand, it feels fantastic, specifically once you've unlocked any speed boost abilities, like the Bene Gesserit Sprint or the Trooper's Shigawire Cable. Those combined with suspensor belts has you zipping around the environment, literally flying across giant swaths of land, and that feels fantastic. I think my biggest gripe, though, with like the baseline combat and movement in this game is it all feels kind of sluggish and slow, like you're kind of lumbering, pulling out your weapon, aiming down sights, even as your character moves around. The movement with the Shigawire Cable and flying and all of that feels really good, but the base movement and the base combat, not super visceral, not super tight, and I wish it were a little bit more snappy. Just my personal preference. While on the topic of combat, I do have concerns about the lack of PvE difficulty as well as variety. It's simply not there. The game is not very difficult and there's not a lot of variety in the PvE side of things. Now, they do progressively add more enemy types a la new weapons that they wield as you move through the zones in Haga Basin, and then you get to the end game where they have their own variants in the Deep Desert, but it's all still just like Humans using weapons, that's what it is. So enemies start off with a mix of having like basic daggers and ranged pistols, and then over time you come across melee enemies with things like swords and rapiers, and you've got ranged ones that have the entire suite of weapons you expect: rifles, snipers, shotguns, SMGs, LMGs, flamethrowers. Some of them even start tossing rocks at you, which is funny. But yeah, it's just a lot of humans with different weapons. So as you move up the tiers, progressing through the zones in Haga Basin, the enemies get tougher, they'll have more health and deal more damage and have more variety of weapons, and that challenge remains until you make that tier's corresponding weapons, gear, and personal shields, which then makes it easier for you to deal with them and take them out quicker. But there's not much complexity in this combat, nor is there anything that really requires what I would call group coordination, on the PvE side at least. The closest thing would be like working together in the deep desert to try to lure the sandworms away while your friends harvest spice. But no, there aren't boss fights that require multiple players doing different things to win the encounter. This game just doesn't really have that as a focus. Now, they have talked about adding more complexity, something that looks more akin to MMO dungeons or raids into the game PvE, but as of now, it's a fairly basic PvE experience that gets tougher until you power up to that current tier and you climb that ladder all the way to endgame, where there is also some similar points of interest with PvE enemies, but the big danger and focus in the deep desert is the PvP, as you're dealing with other players while you attempt to farm resources from those points of interest, or to harvest spice, or to gather ore, etc. As much as I enjoy clearing the camps, the strongholds, and the testing stations, I would love a more fleshed out PvE experience and some proper PvE group content in the future, more dungeons with puzzles, more difficult boss encounters, etc. Now on to bugs. I have still noticed some occasional bugs cropping up. Many of these seem to have to do with weapon swapping, abilities, and your movement. It just seems that at times, if you try swapping weapons while you're also using an ability, things can break. And by break, I mean all of a sudden you literally can't shoot your weapon, you can't aim down sights. There have even been times where I couldn't crouch for some reason. Now, this may happen like once every few hours. It's not super frequent, but it is really annoying when it does happen. And usually I'll just have to try doing a little bit of everything until the issue resolves itself. Worst case scenario, I will just relog real quick and that fixes the issue every time. So that's annoying, but on the plus side, most of the other bugs that I've experienced in prior builds, it seems like they have all been patched out and fixed, which that's a great thing. Now let's talk about PvP. It seems like PvP at the very end game still needs a bit of work. I heard one fellow tester phrase it this way. They said that currently the most effective way to take out another player is to hop in your ornithopter and squash them like a bug. And that's because the time to kill at the moment is so high if you engage in any non-vehicle forms of combat, that being the melee, using ranged weapons, or abilities. Shields are very strong, that is true. Yes, you have to contend with that, but more so, it's just the fact that you get iframe dodging and can literally just keep avoiding damage so long as you maintain enough stamina, and as you progress into the late game, you get the better gear and you get more stats in the various class skill trees. You have a massive pool of stamina, so you can just keep dodging and avoiding all damage for a very long time. Also, the opportunity to run away is very easy, and to the point that direct one-on-one fights pretty much require both parties to stay put like a duel. If anybody wants to leave at any point and disengage, they typically can, with all of the various movement skills in the game, the Shigawara cable, the Bene Gesserit sprint, plus the suspensor belts and more. It makes it so that people can leave fights whenever they want. So again, the best way to kill players come endgame is to run them over with vehicles most of the time. That's the fastest time to kill. And so unfortunately, as of now, it seems that ground warfare, anything that's not vehicle fighting, is just a matter of how long do me and my opponent want to keep doing this dance back and forth until one of us gets bored and decides to leave. Also on PvP, I just want to say here again that I would really love for them to add some official PvP servers to the game. With the recent announcement of there being rentable private servers and those giving players the option to allow for full PvP across the entirety of Haga Basin rather than just being restricted to the tiny areas around the handful of shipwrecks that there are, I'm not quite sure why they don't now also have at least one or two official servers that have the same rule set. The thing is, the deep desert PvP is is quite different from what Haga Basin PvP would look like, mainly because come Deep Desert, everybody's got access to ornithopters, so any ground-focused combat just becomes optional. And as I just mentioned, if you don't want to engage in ground PvP, you can just walk away, zoom away from the fight, hop in your ornithopter, and then fly off somewhere else. I think starting the game in Haga Basin that had some more PvP options, even if there were just multiple zones of the 12 that are in Haga Basin, if they had like 2 or 3 of them flagged for PvP, or the whole thing, if you chose a server that was just full PvP enabled, and you would be told this, and there would be fewer of them. I'm sure there'd be majority PvE focused Haga Basins, but if they had a couple of official PvP focused ones, give players that additional option, I think that'd be great, because I think there's a lot of fun potential with ground engagement and fights before everybody has their ornithopters, before everyone has the best gear and all of their skill tree unlocked. It's the same reason I enjoy like low-level PvP and MMOs. I think there's a lot of fun to be had as we're going through the power progression and getting in fights here and there before everyone has their optimized setups, just making the most of what you have. So I would love to see that. Oh, and there's one final thing that I want to mention in this section of the video, and that's just the fact that I think the way they presented Dune Awakening, both in what they showcase in videos, but also in that beta weekend, really did the game a disservice. Like, the game has way more interesting stuff and more variety than what people might have initially seen in that, specifically in that beta. Mainly, the game just starts to open up and get way more varied, literally like immediately after the first 3 zones, which is all we had access to in that beta weekend. Once you start venturing into the areas in and surrounding the rift, it's just a whole lot cooler. We have this like massive crevice, basically, this big ravine that extends across multiple zones. I think it extends the center and the width of like 3 or 4 zones, and it's many, many layers deep, and all along those layers are different points of interest. You got crashed shipwrecks in there, you've got mining facilities, you've got enemy strongholds, you've got ones that run from the top to the bottom. The deeper you get in this rift, it looks cooler and cooler, and that is just one example of an area that's way more interesting and varied than what the beta with only having southern Haga Basin and the western and eastern Familius Gap. Everything was basically swaths of sand dunes and islands of rock within which were points of interest, and a lot of those points of interest looked the same. It was like the encampments of enemies, right? It gets way more interesting, it gets way more vertical. Not only is there that deep ravine called the Rift, but there's also towering rocks everywhere and enemy encampments that are holed up in there, and also a lot of the enemy points of interest are much bigger, and I mean literally, like, there are points of interest that are 5 times bigger than the biggest points of interest that you came across in those first few areas. The point is, there's just way more cool areas, points of interest, and environments than what many players have seen thus far, and I think that's a shame, because I think even if they opened up just like 1 or 2 additional zones in that beta weekend, people would have had a better impression. But regardless, I don't really care. I'm not here to sell the game. I just think it's worth noting for people that there is more interesting things. It's still the desert, it's still mostly sand, but it does get more varied and interesting. There are even zones that have legitimate plant life, like an arid desert with cacti and shrubs and stuff, which I don't think a lot of people were expecting. They thought it was all just going to be sand dunes and rock isles like it was in the first 3 zones, but no. For still being a desert, it gets more varied and interesting. The points of interest get far more interesting and varied in terms of how they look and their size. It just gets a lot better than what a lot of people may be led to believe. All right, I want to talk about now some things that I got wrong. There were some concerns that I addressed in prior videos that in the end turned out to not be a problem. One thing that I vocalized was disliking the apparent requirement to melee once you started coming across shielded enemies. The weapons we had during the beta test weekend were hilariously ineffective against shields, which led me to believe that melee via the slow blade attack was the only means of dealing with them. And then there's the fact that the further you get into the game, the more and more shielded enemies you come across. Well, as it turns out, that was incorrect. You aren't forced to melee for 2 reasons. One, there are multiple classes of weapons that specifically counter shields. In fact, in the beta, there was a blueprint for a purple SMG, which I found after making the video where I complained about this, and that gun would tear through any shielded enemy in just a couple of seconds. Now, beyond that, there are also many other weapons that counter shields, like the drill shot class of guns, where you fire these multiple rounds of drills, and once they hit a shield, they chew through it. If the enemy doesn't dodge after like a second, it passes through and deals a heavy amount of damage. And there are many more weapons that are great against shields beyond those 2 examples. Aside from those weapons, though, Even shielded enemies are vulnerable to regular gunfire anytime they themselves shoot. So when you come across, for example, those big guys who are lumbering around with LMGs and shielded, or they've got flamethrowers, anytime they fire their weapon, you may not have noticed, but their shields drop just like yours do when you fire your weapon, which means you can fire away with whatever weapon that you're using and they are going to take damage. You're not shooting against their shield while they are shooting, and that's the opportunity to kill them because their shields drop when they shoot you. So you shoot back, aim for the head, you'll kill them in a few shots. Another thing that I got wrong was my concern that Dune as an IP would hold the game back in terms of variety of locations as well as enemy variety. Now that is pretty much the case for this current version of the game. We are on Arrakis at launch and it is 95% desert with sand dunes and rocks and some extra variety that comes in the dungeons or testing stations where they've got some water, which translates to having some plant life. But it turns out that the Dune lore as a whole includes various other planets with vastly different biomes, other alien races besides just humans, which is all we're currently fighting, and there are even super advanced AI robots, and this variety of locations and enemies could and likely will eventually make its way into the game, assuming it's successful and they continue to support it for the months and years ahead. Though at release, they are strictly focused on Arrakis and the different factions of humans there, there is definitely still potential within the Dune IP for way more variety. We in fact already know that the first big planned expansion that they're going to come out with is taking place on the polar ice caps of Arrakis, which means we'll be going from the barren sand desert to the barren ice desert, but at least it'll be white and blue instead of yellow and brown, right? Now, having gone over all of that, I do want to wrap up by mentioning the fact that some of the things that we've complained about and been concerned about in the past have improved over time. Changes that I've noticed while playing in the private closed beta over the past few weeks. First of all, the melee, the Perma-Stun lock issue that we all had a good laugh about during the PvP showcase with a bunch of streamers, that's been fixed. It is no longer an issue. A patch that went live about a week on the CBT build after the Twitch showcase took care of it completely. Essentially now, whenever you're drained of stamina, you basically get the second wind that kicks in, nearly instantly refilling your bar. This comes with its own sound effect and animation, but the basic thing here is you can no longer ever be permanently stun locked as you were in those prior showcases, and there's also now a stamina cost to melee attacks, which means players attacking you can no longer just infinitely spam that either. Now, while there are still some bugs that remain, I do have to mention it's far, far less. During the preview event where I made my initial early review, we had players being invisible, we had T-posing characters, we had certain interactions like retrieving all loot from chests not working, we had disappearing textures and clipping through the terrain. None of those issues have surfaced in the subsequent 100+ hours that I've played since the beta test weekend and the preview event. So a lot of bugs and issues have been addressed. Also, across the board, performance has gotten better and better with every subsequent patch. In fact, during my time in the closed beta, they've been updating the game literally daily. So every day they would take down servers for about an hour early in the morning, sometime between 7 and 8 a.m. my time. And then when they came back up, there would be a new patch every time. And that patch would typically come with bug fixes, performance fixes, but also many balance adjustments and changes to mechanics. But yes, performance-wise, I would say in the past, my performance was good 95% of the time, whereas in the most recent build, as of yesterday, it's good 99% of the time. I still do get an occasional hiccup here and there, which for me on my rig, which includes a RTX 4090 and an i9 14900K, it's been mostly great. 99% of the time, performance is good. But yes, I do have a fairly beefy PC, so I would look out for feedback from people who are running the game on mid to lower end hardware if that's what you have as well. So to wrap up this video, yes, if you haven't heard, while the game's not without its problems, I really like this game. I really do. I am super pumped for launch. I feel like a kid on Christmas, frankly, which doesn't happen all too often as the years go by. So I'm happy to embrace it and enjoy it whenever it does. I would by no means consider this a 10 out of 10 game. Not even close. I would guess, if I were to try to peer into the future and guess what the public's average review score would be, I want to say it'll be between a 6 and an 8. Probably not higher than an 8, but probably not lower than a 6. 6, 7, 8 out of 10 is where I expect the average review score to pan out. But for me personally, it gives me 10 out of 10 fun. I'm not saying I think it's a 10 out of 10 game. I'm saying on the 10 scale of fun that I'm having, It's a 10 out of 10. I have 10 out of 10 fun. Make of that what you will. I don't know. I certainly hope they improve and address some or all of my concerns. But other than that, I'm really looking forward to jumping in this week. I'm likely going to be streaming the game some on Twitch. I've been doing that a little more frequently recently. So if you feel like swinging by, feel free. If you're sick of hearing about Dune, don't worry. We've got some other videos coming up. There's some more games that I'm covering. One that I'm actually really excited about that I'll be checking out during the launch week of Dune, which is kind of a bummer for me because I just wanted to no life it for at least a week, but I'll take a day off to check out this other game, and there'll be a video for that next week. But yeah, I'm looking forward to binging and having a lot of fun during this period, and maybe some of you are as well. It's going to be a mix. The game may very well have a mixed rating on Steam. I think there's a good chance of that, but like I've said before, it just ticks enough of the right boxes. I really, really like it. Can't wait to play with my friends as well. This should be a blast. But that's it for today. Thank you as always for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed this vid. I'll see you in the next one, all right? Take it easy.